Oh, it's always inspiring to see neighbors collaborating in such a creative way. Thanks for sharing your spaces with us. Right now, we're going to be turning our attention to growing bromeliads in our garden right here in Central Texas. And we're joined by one of our favorite guests, Scott Ogden. Great to have you back on the program, Scott.
Great to be here.
And for those who don't know, who haven't been, Scott, one of the preeminent Texas garden authors, plant expert, and great designer. Plant-driven design is your company that you work with your wonderful wife. So it's always, as I said, a pleasure to have you on the program. But I have to say, growing bromeliads in Austin, Scott, I always think of you as being out on the edge, but this, for a lot of folks, this sounds like a step too far.
Well, I think for a lot of folks, they're probably right. So it is maybe a step too far, but I wanted to push it. And a few years ago, I had the opportunity to co-design a garden in Florida with Gary Smith down in Naples, and we got to use some bromeliads there as a big feature. And I kind of got excited about the idea of using them as garden plants. I'd known them for years as pot plants.
Right, everybody does, and everybody admires them in the containers, but we always think, got to protect them.
Right, and I also had grown for many years, some of the cacti that are native to southern Brazil, and had pretty good luck with them in Austin. So I know some of the places where those grow are the same where some of the bromeliads managed to make it that far south, down in southernmost Brazil, like Rio Grande do Sul, and then on into Uruguay and Argentina. And so I thought, maybe give it a shot and see if there weren't some that would work here in Austin.
Okay, well, we know some bromeliads do work here in Austin.
Well, that would be the other thing. We have some native ones here. Our ball moss, which doesn't get much respect most of the time.
No.
I will have to say, everyone should know it is harmless to trees, so don't have to get rid of it. But if you don't like it, you can. And then we also have, in places where it's really humid, the Spanish moss.
Right.
And for those who want to try it, there's a hybrid between the two that nurseries have developed in California, and you could try to plant it here. But if you do that, you're going to run into the same issue you run with any of these tillandsias, even if you just hang them up for the summer, and that is that in the summertime, the squirrels really enjoy taking a bite of that leaf because they're thirsty.
Right, and they're filled with water.
Right, so you kind of have to put them on a very flimsy branch that a squirrel can't climb if you're going to try to do that.
Okay.
And my recommendation, if you're going to do one at all, would be to do this bromeliad. This is the native giant ball moss from South Texas.
That's pretty giant.
Yeah. I think people who have it down around the King Ranch, they get kind of scared when they see these on their live oaks there.
Right.
It makes them nervous. But it's actually a rather handsome bromeliad. It's Tillandsia baileyii.
Tillandsias are the rage right now for growing.
Well, that's fine. But anyway, anyway, if you can order them from nurseries, and you'll get a plant about this size usually.
Right.
And if you wait a while, you will eventually get something like this. If you go to down in South Texas, south of Corpus Christi, keep on going down towards the valley. If you see live oaks and you look, you'll often find these falling down on the ground right underneath them, and you can just pick them up.
Well, it's quite striking and can be used in a lot of different ways as garden ornaments or as garden plants. So and they bloom. These are not in bloom in the moment, but I understand the blooms are very attractive.
Yeah, that's pink spikes with little blue flowers coming out of them. They're quite pretty, and that's a very, very tough plant. Has no problem with any of the cold that we get in Austin, and even farther out of town if you're out in the hill country.
Right.
Most of the other plants we're going to talk about today are really for people who are in the central city where you've got fairly warm temperatures.
Right,
and
heat island effect,
and not where you've got a cold sink where you've got cold air that collects. I don't think you'll be able to pull them off very well if you've got that kind of situation.
Okay, so we're talking about well protected from the cold, quick draining soils. There are two different kinds of bromeliads that you want to talk about.
Yeah, bromeliads are kind of interesting plants in that they evolved at some point in their life little scales, kind of what makes this plant look gray on it, that allow them to absorb dew and moisture directly through their leaves.
Right.
And other bromeliads, are dependent on their roots to be able to hold moisture and bring that up, just like other plants are.
Sure.
But the ones that have those trichomes, actually, some of them have just developed instead tanks where they collect water in the throat of the plant, and then they're able to absorb that directly through those little scales into the plant.
Sure.
And they don't even actually have to have roots. That's why they can grow up in the trees if they want to, just using the roots to grab onto the branch.
Right. Well, for years, I know a lot of Austin gardeners have been playing with Daikias, which are one of the rooted forms, right?
That's right.
There's another form called the Puya.
Daikias and Puyas are terrestrial bromeliads, both native to South America. We have a native terrestrial bromeliad in Texas, Hectea, and the Hecteas honestly are not very cold hardy. The few that are in Texas barely cross the Rio Grande, and they're really mean and thorny. The Daikias and the Puyas actually are less. Some of those are very thorny too, but they're generally less thorny and they're prettier. And they're much more cold hardy and more adapted to our humid weather here in Austin.
Right. And there are the rooted forms we've been talking about, and then the tank forms. And what are some of the prominent tank forms that you've been
the
playing
typical
with?
bromeliads we think of as a big vase shape are Echmeas or Neoregelias, Bilbergias. The Neoregelias, for the most part, are probably not. There are very few of those that are cold hardy, but there are several Echmeas and several Bilbergias that grow way down in Brazil where it freezes. And so those have been the ones that do best here. What I found, though, is that even the hardy ones, if they come from a very moist area and they have very thin leaves that are very soft and flaccid, those tanks, if they're subjected to drought, they'll start to collapse.
I see.
And then when you water them, the water doesn't hold in them again.
Okay.
And so the ones you need are the ones that are a bit stiffer, and those tend to come from beach areas.
Okay.
So, and in Brazil, that's known by the term Restinga, which is Restinga, Restinga, but Restinga is the beach environment, and those are the bromeliads that seem to match what Austin has to offer.
And you've been using those in your garden here in Austin, and there's several forms, and they're strikingly beautiful. They have like the architecture that a lot of people are hungry for in their plants, but they have other qualities that really recommend them.
Yeah, they have colored foliage, and they have foliage that's translucent often. So with our strong light in the summer, I mean, I have a shady garden that's under oaks, and it's a small garden, and a lot of the time, it's hot enough outside. I don't even want to go outside in it, but I like looking out my window and seeing the light playing across these plants. And they, so many of the plants we try to grow in Texas have a kind of a lifeless look sometimes in the summer.
Sure.
These actually look very lush, and they really don't need a whole lot of water. They're quite xeric, and that tank, if you fill it up once a week, it's good to go, and you don't really have to deal with that.
Any special concerns regarding the tanks in terms of attracting wildlife, mosquitoes, etc.?
There are rewards and concerns both with that, and in particular, if you have tank bromeliads in your garden, you are going to have a nice population of anoles. They really love them. The male anoles like to stake one of those out and make that their hotel. They get lots of action from the ladies if they've got a really good bromeliad as their home. But part of the reason they like that, I think, is because it's also attractive to insects like mosquitoes. And so that's food for the anoles, but if you're concerned about that being an issue, you probably would want to treat the water that's in the bromeliads to deal with that.
All right. Well, in terms of growing the rooted ones, let's spend a little time talking about that. What kind of growing medium do you like to use?
I actually don't use a medium because I'm not doing these as pot plants. I'm putting them in the ground. What I do sometimes do, you want to provide support for the plant. It is holding water, and so you don't want that fairly heavy tank to be listing over to the side. So it needs good support. And you don't want it to be a heavy, muddy clay, something like that, that could rot it and stay cold and wet in the wintertime. So if you're dealing with a clay soil, I would recommend mixing in decomposed granite, something like that. And again, remembering the varieties that seem to do best here are the ones that naturally grow on beach sand. That's what they come from. So that's the kind of soil that I would mix in with it.
Quick drainage, and I often think of these as arboreal.
Filtered shade is definitely, for Texas in general too. I mean, everything needs filtered shade here pretty much in the summertime. So.
Yeah, don't we all? Right.
Yeah,
So real quickly, where can people find these special forms?
Well, one of the other things I learned when I did this project in Florida years ago is that there are some nurseries there in particular that have just amassed tremendous collections and rather rare things that have been collected from the wild. Here in Texas, Yucadu Nursery, they've done quite a bit of collecting in southern Brazil, and they have a lot of their own introductions from there.
Cool.
So anyway, online there you can find several bromeliad nurseries that would have a lot of those resources.
Okay. Well, Scott Ogden, thank you as always for pushing the frontiers of gardening in Austin and other places. It's great to have you again as our guest.
Well, thanks for allowing me to share my private passion.
Okay, very good. Again, Scott Ogden and Plant Driven Design. Coming up next is our friend Daphne.